morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I brought with me my colleague, Tom Stacy, who's a technical advisor to the IICC. We're both volunteers. He's receiving an here today. I'm the director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition in Blissfield, Michigan, where Representative Nancy Jenkins' district. We are a bipartisan group, 40% Democrat, 60% Republican. Most of our supporters live on the front line of wind energy development around the state. We seek energy policy as affordable, reliable, socially and environmentally responsible. A couple of thoughts before I get into my presentation. First of all, I would say that the position of our group is we support a freeze of the RPS, though we would recommend that phase out as the existing wind plants expire. We'd like to see that go to zero. Secondly, I've heard a number of questions that I know are not going to be directly in my presentation about the impact of wind and capacity factor of existing power plants and what that has to do with the cost of the ratepayers. I think the chairman is reaching that conclusion. We know that wind drives down the capacity factors of our existing regulated power plants, which means over time those rate cases have to increase their cost to recover that lost revenue. That's because wind is not a one-to-one replacement for a dispatchable generator. In fact, it has a parasite-host relationship with fossil fuel generators. The more wind and solar you have, the less runtime you have on your existing fleet, or particularly your new ones. Therefore, their rate cases will have to increase every year as their capacity factor is reduced by the parasitic relationship of wind and solar. I'll go through these things as briefly as possible. The first myth that we hear often, and I've heard some of these things repeated this morning, is that it's in the best interest of the state to require all renewable generation to be located here. And we've already heard the justifications for that today. The first problem that we have with that requirement is easily demonstrated in this map. You see our regional peer in MISO, Iowa. They have great quantities of 8.5 meter per second wind. Michigan has essentially none. What this means is that Iowa wind has a permanent 2-to-1 price advantage for their wind energy versus Michigan's. We cannot recover that with improvements in technology. This chart shows the change in renewable energy or wind energy power purchase agreement contract prices over time. The red line I've added in myself, which shows where Michigan's PPAs stack up. So the first observation I would make is, as much as we want to hear it suggested that it was improvements in technology that have reduced the price of our wind energy contracts in Michigan, we can see that in 2010 and 2009, when our first PPAs were approved.
Can you make sure we get a copy of this when you're...
I know Jeff has it. I'm sorry, I did not get it to the clerk.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. We can see that when Michigan was approving $108 and $110 power purchase agreements, the rest of the nation was already at $60, $70. But we've always been a high-cost wind producer. The taller turbines have not had a meaningful impact on our relative competitiveness with our much windier regional peers. The second problem is that the in-state mandate is unconstitutional. Judge Posner opined such in a manner that Attorney General Schuette had about socialized costs of transmission costs. Michigan cannot, without violating the Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution, discriminate against out-of-state renewable energy. I would argue, in fact, that if you are a fan of wind energy, you would want to be able to acquire the greatest quantity for the lowest price, and it's beyond dispute that Michigan cannot furnish that. The state of Ohio has concurred. They have frozen both their mandates, and they have permanently eliminated the in-state requirement for renewable energy. Iberdrola Renewables testified it would be very difficult to build wind in the state of Ohio without an in-state generation mandate. I can only conclude that that's because it's not competitive. Curiously, in a deregulated state like Ohio, the major utilities there all supported that repeal, or freeze. I would say that adding wind capacity to our existing portfolio, because it does not replace the capital investments in coal and gas-fired capacity, has the net result of forcing our ratepayers to push 2 shopping carts down the aisle when only one would suffice. And since the utilities get a guaranteed regulated return on both, it's to their benefit to build wind and gas, or to add wind to coal. It does not obviate the need for them to build future capacity resources. Wind is not a capacity resource. As a result of our illegal in-state mandate, we could have been perhaps buying Iowa wind contracts for $22 a megawatt hour. our fleet average is $75 a megawatt hour subsidized, and our lowest average PPA price is around 50 bucks. Next myth, the wind energy is cheaper than coal. This comes largely from our annual report in PA 295, which required that cost comparison between wind and coal. And we see headlines like this: report shows Michigan wind power now cheaper than coal. Unfortunately, that's deceptive at a number of levels. But the main one is that wind and coal energy have different values. Dr. Josko, an eminent economist at MIT, says the production profiles for intermittent dispatchable generation and the value of the electricity they produce are likely to be very different, making comparisons based on levelized cost alone meaningless. This chart from ERCOT makes it very clear. The yellow trend line on the bottom is the actual output of their wind on a given day this March. The top line shows their load profile over time. You can see that wind's output tends to be highest when demand is the lowest, and wind output is the lowest when demand is highest. Price correlates with demand. So wind is most abundant when the value of electricity is the lowest. The PA 295 report, through our encouragement, has added a disclaimer to that section where they compare wind and coal, and they say renewable energy wind resources are not equivalent on a capacity basis when compared to coal-fired or other base load generation. There is, however, an accurate way to compare the value of wind electricity to what it brings to the system, and my concern about the IRP process is that it needs to recognize this fact. The only way to value wind properly in its role in the system is to ask what is it replacing inside that system. And it does not replace future investments in capital generators like gas, coal, or nuclear. It simply replaces the fuel. We are paying subsidized average of $75 a megawatt hour for wind. Unsubsidized, it's easily over $100 a megawatt hour. Now, you could argue that the subsidies are somebody else's responsibility. Well, it's true. They shift the cost from the ratepayer to the taxpayer. Unfortunately, we are essentially the same entity. The value of the fuel that we're saving with wind is about 25 bucks a megawatt hour in the case of coal, or roughly $35 for natural gas. That's a poor value for the ratepayer. Myth 3, wind energy is an effective hedge against natural gas price volatility. This is a very common misperception. The promoters of wind, and I've heard it this morning, like to believe that the choice before us is wind or gas, but that is false. Wind energy is largely dependent upon gas-fired generators for grid integration. How do we know? The American Wind Energy Association says so about using wind in the baseload space. Both Invenergy and NextEra are as well members of the American Wind Energy Association. They say a combination of a large amount of renewable energy combined with flexible natural gas plants and demand response and efficiency can ensure that our electric system has sufficient energy capacity, flexibility, and operates reliably. It's wind and gas. What we know is that wind energy's ability to penetrate the grid is determined by the presence of gas generators. General Electric explained this to the Obama White House when they looked at some of the draft rules for CO2 reduction. They said, if flexible generation assets such as gas turbines are not available, renewable technologies will not be deployed. In other words, gas turbines are an essential component of renewable energy sources' ability to penetrate the market. General Electric is also a board member of the American Wind Energy Association. What's my point? Unlike coal and nuclear power, wind energy is wholly dependent upon gas-fired generation if substantial penetrations of wind are being deployed. That means that the more wind generation in a given region, the more gas generation that is required. More gas means more exposure to the gas market, not less. Now I'm going to show you a few slides. We can argue about whether the ratio in any given RTO is 2 parts gas to 1 part wind or 1.5, but essentially, the truth is, every unit of wind energy we mandate, we commit our ratepayers to deploying and maintaining about 2 additional units of gas generation. Thus, a wind mandate is an even larger gas mandate. You can't hedge something by committing your ratepayers to ever-growing portions and quantities of the resource that you're hoping to hedge against. Here's our current generation portfolio, roughly 44% coal, 14% gas, 32% nuke, 3% wind, and 7% some of the other things we've heard about. Now mind you, we're only at 3% wind, not 10 as some people seem to believe. We've only gone to about 3, maybe slightly over. If we raise our percentage of wind to 10%, we will have to raise our gas generation roughly from 14 to 20%. If we raise our wind penetration to 20%, you will see what happens next is our gas generation will have to rise to perhaps 40%, and that will come at the expense of coal. We're driven coal largely out of the market. Nuclear remains stable. And oddly, if we were to go to actual 30% delivered wind energy, you will see coal and nuclear both have largely been pushed out of the market, and 60% of the balance of our resource mix will be gas. What's my point? When you compare to where we are today versus a very high penetration of wind, you'll see that we will quadruple our exposure to the gas market. That cannot be a hedge. That cannot be a hedge. Secondly, we have a number of fuels available to us today, gas, coal, and nuclear. Since 2008, perversely, after we adopted PA 295, the value of gas has dropped precipitously to the cost. Now, if we take our PPA contracts back to 2009 when they were first reported up to today, and we put them on this chart, you'll see the blue line represents that number. The bottom line is red that shows the relative value of gas per megawatt hour of energy generated. It might be slightly low, I could have perhaps raised it a few points, but nonetheless, it doesn't change things much. At no point since 2008 has a subsidized Michigan wind PPA cost less than the gas fuel it has saved. In fact, wind has cost ratepayers 2.5 to 5 times the value of the fuel saved. And what about the production tax credit? The 2015 report on PA 295 says that DT Energy's Meade wind plant would have a PPA price of $47 to $53. But they also report that if the project does not qualify for the PTC, the price would rise to $80. That's volatile as well. And I will report that on Tuesday, the people of Meade Township rejected Detroit Edison's request to approve their wind project in their community at roughly 60 to 40% opposed. Representative McBroom is correct. I am involved with every wind project in the state of Michigan. I can tell you the upper limit for penetration of wind in the state of Michigan is not determined by gas or transmission. It's determined by social acceptance, and we are at the tipping point in the state of Michigan. If we look back at an $80 power purchase agreement, in other words, the latest DTE proposal, minus the production tax credit, we realize that'd be at $80. Only once in the last 20 years has that $80 PPA price would have been a hedge against gas price volatility, and then only for a few months. Wind promoters would have us to believe that it's the wind part of a 20-year power purchase agreement that brings any hedge value. But it's the 20-year part of the contract that yields a theoretical hedge, not the underlying wind technology. Worse, what kind of gas price hedge requires you to commit to purchasing 2 units of gas at market price for every 1 unit you hedge? Finally, I would say, if a 20-year wind power purchase agreement at $80 per megawatt hour is somehow valuable as a gas price hedge, then would not a 20, 30, or 40-year fixed price power purchase agreement for Illinois nuclear or Canadian hydro at say 50 or 60 bucks, would that not be a superior hedge? It's not the wind that gives us any hedging protection. It's the fact that wind is the only commodity, except for solar, showing up with the option of a fixed price contract. And remember, we have 2 price-stable fuels now, coal and uranium. The special interests who wish to increase Michigan's wind penetration as a gas price hedge also want to deny us access to our 2 most price-stable fuels, leaving us dependent upon only renewables and volatile gas. Curiously, many of those interests also oppose fracking. The last couple points quickly. Wind energy is valuable as a means of reducing the consumption of water in the power generation sector. We do withdraw a lot of water for energy, about 8.8 billion gallons a day. The thermoelectric power sector returns 98% of it. The 2% that remains evaporates, goes to the clouds, Mr. Sun turns it into rain, and it comes back to the source from which it is drawn. So the 8.4 billion gallons of water we draw each day is 0.00014% of the total volume of the Great Lakes, and we return 98% of it. My point is, mandating wind energy as a means of protecting the water is selling an imaginary cure for a non-existent disease. Myth 5, wind mandates create jobs in the new economy. Let me address one point quickly, and I will go quickly over the slides. The energy source that is most valuable for all industry and for all human activity in the state of Michigan would require only 1 employee to turn it on and off. Because energy is an overhead cost for all human activity. The more people you employ in that sector, the more you are likely to raise the cost of all other human activity associated with it. Secondly, we know that wind mandates in a given state are not equal to turbine jobs. OEA reports that Ohio has more wind-related manufacturing facilities than any other state in the nation, but they only have about 400 megawatts of installed wind capacity. If in-state mandates of wind turbines results in increased manufacturing jobs, Texas and Ohio, or in Iowa would be number one and number two, not Ohio. And I'm going to ignore the costs. I'll just say quickly, the U.S. steel industry spends $18 billion a year on electricity. They have 100,000 employees. If you raise the cost of electricity only 10%, that's $18,000 per year per employee, no longer available for typically union wages and benefits. Our wind contracts at $75 are 2.5 times the average MISO price for electricity. Finally, this is an important one. The Clean Power Plan requires us to build renewables to cost-effectively reduce emissions. This one's very important because I'm hearing that it's getting a lot of traction here. We got really lucky. MISO did an analysis of the EPA Clean Power Plan, and they put prices and values on the various building blocks as well as an alternative. We will see that, first of all, out of the 4 building blocks, wind is by far the most expensive means to reduce CO2, according to the engineers at MISO, $270 per ton. We see some of the other options are cheaper. Secondly, the energy efficiency part, likewise, is the second most expensive means of complying with the Clean Power Plan at about $70 per ton. All the blocks combined are at $60. Now, mind you, CO2 is generally valued between $15 and $30 a ton. But MISO says we have another option, which is to use the mass-based calculation approach to comply. And they say that if we do that, we can do it for $38 rather than using the building blocks. It turns out that just building combined cycle gas turbines is by far the cheapest way to comply with the Clean Power Plan. The renewables and energy efficiency part are more expensive, according to the engineers at MISO. Curiously, the energy efficiency and the renewable energy mandates largely mirror our own RPS in Michigan, which shows us that in terms of accomplishing emissions reductions, PA 295, like those 2 building blocks of the Clean Power Plan, are not very cost effective and when evaluated on the price per ton of CO2 avoided. And what about health impacts from emissions? We've built about $3 billion worth of wind turbines, which roughly function as a 450 megawatt intermittent generator. We run about 12,500 megawatts of generation over the year on average. Assuming this wind only displaced Michigan coal, that $3 billion would reduce coal plant emissions by 7%, but probably much less. Because it's going to interrupt some out-of-state resources and it's going to interrupt gas, which is far cleaner. Combined cycle gas emit essentially no mercury and no health impact in fine particulates, which is where the asthma claims are coming from. $3 billion worth of new combined cycle gas turbines instead of wind would have already cut our statewide mercury and PM 2.5 emissions by half and CO2 by 25%. In fact, if we built gas instead of wind, I think we would largely have satisfied the requirements of the Clean Power Plan, depending on which date they look back to. Conclusion. If the Michigan wind mandates could deliver on 1 or 2 of the 6 pervasive myths I've outlined above, it may be worth continuing, but it cannot deliver on those claims. Our humble request for this body today, we wholeheartedly support the repeal of renewable energy mandates. We feel that they both have poor economic value and a poor environmental value. Our liberal supporters in the IICC concur with climate scientist James Hansen, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the United States, China, and India, or the world as a whole, is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you. Vice Chair LeBoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming and testifying. And I guess looking at in general what you're saying, I think there's more value to generation than cost. And that's kind of what you're getting at, because if that's the case, then maybe we should just move all of our production facilities for automobiles and everything else over to China, and then you just have to worry about the shipping costs because labor costs are lower there. Do you have a comment on that? I mean, to not invest in Michigan and Michigan workers and tax base?
Sure, we have to look at both sides of the ledger. And yes, it's easy enough to count the positive job gains, but it's much harder to account the aggregate impacts upon other industries. So if we use renewable energy mandates and they, first of all, do not cost effectively reduce CO2, which I think is largely an established fact, and yet they increase the price of energy for all other users, It's much harder to tally the loss and impact on jobs and employments in the other sectors.
Well, and I guess I kind of disagree with that, because I think that we have jobs that are in Michigan. I mean, you heard from Scott from Ventower, Scott Messiana, and 167 jobs in my community. I don't see where, and I've said this with other debates even in the last term, if you could show me that there would be more job creation and more jobs in my community by either opening up everything to retail access, and I know that's not this part of the discussion, and the same with these same assertions with wind, then I might be for it. But in my case, in the district that I represent, there's 167 jobs at Ventower. I forget how many at the Monroe coal plant. I don't even know how many directly with the Fermi nuclear facility. But under what your assertions are, if it's just based on cost flat out, I don't think that those jobs would be there. So that's the issue that I have. And what jobs would come in to replace those just because we have cheaper electricity?
Well, I think it's hard to analyze, again, the negative cost of higher priced electricity to all other industries in other districts. Secondly, we know the clean power plant is causing job losses in your district as some of those power plants are being closed. Senator Zorn also covers your district as well, is that correct? Yeah, he and I discussed that. I mean, we have people in my community who are losing their jobs at some of the coal-fired power plants there. So, it's the wind mandates are a result of the same kind of thinking that are leading to the closure of our coal plants and some of those stranded assets, which are also costs that then can get spread across ratepayers and have additional harm to others.
And the last one is, will you mind coming to my house and telling my two daughters that there is no such thing as a tooth fairy or Easter bunny?
Well, I've had Mr. Hanson do it, not me.
Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. So, thanks for the testimony and providing a different balance and your work on this. I guess the question is that you'd prefer even phasing out the RPS or eliminating in the long term, and yet that wouldn't destroy a renewable energy market because those that make sense will still be there, hydro or some other areas, or can you?
Absolutely. I would say if we could offer, if we're going to stick with a power purchase agreement construct, which I'm not really a big fan of, but I certainly would not be opposed to locking in 20 or 30 years worth of cheap Canadian hydro. I mean, if that's available to us, that's fine. So I'm not opposed to the concept of renewables. Idaho has 75% renewable and the cheapest electricity in the nation. I only wish that were us.
And we're seeing that it's social acceptance instead of technological. I mean, you saw across the border in Ontario that they don't really have any local control over the siting of windmills, from my understanding. Don't have the same zoning. We saw a township earlier this week, the residents reject a new windmill park, I think 60-40, if I remember the numbers correctly. And they're surrounded by some wind in some of the other parts of that same county. And so we're starting to get to that point of social acceptance, and so with having still local zoning, that penetration can work one way or the other.
That's right, yeah, but I'm going to be very polite here, but some of the interests representing wind developers in this room today talk about social acceptance in these communities, but I can tell you from firsthand experience, in general, what decides where a wind project gets built is not determined by a majority vote of the people that live there, but whether or not a majority of the policymakers, planning commission members, and township trustees have first signed leases with wind developers. Fairgrove Township had 9 out of 13 elected and appointed officials with wind leases, I think with NextEra, and they openly deliberated to create wind-friendly zoning in that community. That is common and pervasive.
Okay, not seeing any other questions. Thank you for your time, and I know you're a resource to members of the committee, and I'll make sure Rep. Sens that on the presentation to the other committee members.
Thank you.